Hello and welcome back to our virtual book club dedicated to reading Fiona Tan's 10 Madnesses. I hope you've got your hands on a copy of the book by now and have read up to page 48. It's a book that can be hard to get hold of, but here at Bethlem Museum of the Mind we still have copies available to send to UK addresses at a cost of £16.50, postage and packing included. If you want details of how to make an order, just send an email to info@motm.org.uk and we'll get back to you. Last week I introduced you to Theodore Géricault and his 5 famous portraits of monomania, as featured in 10 Madnesses and now in museum collections across Europe and one in North America. Also, I introduced you to Alexander Morrison, Bethlem physician in the first half of the 19th century, and spoke about the sketches and paintings that he commissioned of some of his patients, and I'm propped up in front of one of them now. Or, more accurately, I'm propped up in front of 2 portraits of the same patient at different stages of her residence and treatment at Bethlem, which I'll come on to talk about later. For now, I want to stay with Géricault's portraits and the picture they paint, or that Fiona Tan paints, of their provenance through her painstaking archival research. In reading the account of this research, which fills most of the pages of 10 Madnesses up to page 48, I was reminded of a comment I read in a month or two ago in the Times Literary Supplement. The review was of another book by an author who had done a similar quantity of archival digging. And the reviewer remarked that on the strength of having discovered something unique and interesting in the archive, the author made the classic mistake that archive treasure hunters often do, which is to share everything unique that they'd discovered, whether or not it was also interesting. I must confess that by the point I read in the inventory of Dr. Georget's estate that he had left 29 pairs of socks, 10 handkerchiefs and an antique dagger, amongst other things, I was beginning to feel that way myself. But in fairness to Fiona Tan, she is on a hunt for information about anything about the 5 surviving paintings, as well as for any clues about the movements of the 5 missing ones. So there's a point to her thoroughness, which is to demonstrate that our author has left no stone unturned in her search. After 5 months, we're told, Fiona Tan decided that it was time to draw a line under this particular strand of empirical inquiry and to turn her efforts towards the imaginative construal of the lives of the sitters in the surviving portraits. To do this, she returned in the first instance to careful observation of the paintings themselves, and was lucky to be able to travel to Frankfurt at a time that they were hosting the Images of Life and Death exhibition, which featured 4 of the 5 paintings, as I mentioned last week. In the exercise of sympathetic imagination, Tan is in her element. I don't know about you, but I found the compassionate and contemporary way that she related to the portraits on page 47 very moving. She writes, "Now that I look closer at the male patients, I can see that they are all unshaven. They are all wearing quite heavy clothing in layers, as if for winter, but it's not possible to tell for certain what season it is. I am reminded of the many vagrants I see here on the streets and at traffic lights in Los Angeles, who wear numerous layers of clothing regardless of the weather." It's probably worth adding that Fiona Tan is not the only person who has written about Géricault's portraits in recent years, and in particular, the psychotherapist Robert Snell has made them the subject of a book entitled Portraits of the Insane. Perhaps the easiest way into that book is a podcast of a talk Snell gave at the Freud Museum back in 2016 on the subject of his book, which is still available on the internet. Here at Bethlem Museum of the Mind, we don't have any of Géricault's portraits in our collections for us to pay careful attention to with a view to trying to imaginatively inhabit the lives of the sitters. However, as it happens, we do have a number of the portraits that Alexander Morrison commissioned of Bethlem patients. These are on temporary loan to us from the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, And the two that are behind me show the same patient at different times, as I've said. The portraits of this lady also appear in Morrison's published Physiognomy of Insanity. The identity of the sitter is withheld there, but details are given of her condition around the time this first portrait was painted, 8 weeks after her arrival at Bethlem in 1838. And this is what Morrison writes about her. She attempted to jump out of a window. She is disposed to tear her clothes. She frequently drops on her knees. Her conversation is incoherent. Sometimes she says that she is strange, or that she is mad, or that she shall destroy her child, or cut her own throat. Clearly this is a lady in very deep distress. She was said to be suffering from puerperal insanity, or puerperal mania. If we were to hazard a retrospective diagnosis, which is always a dangerous thing to do, by the way, we might opt for something like postpartum psychosis. And restraint was found to be necessary, according to Morrison. The form this restraint takes is shown in the portrait. Her hands appear to be locked into mittens, which would prevent her from tearing her own clothes or from doing harm to herself or others. And in this portrait there is a second disturbing hint of the patient's heavily circumscribed existence at Bethlem. I don't know how clearly you can see the picture, but right at the top here there is a hand which is placed on the top of her head to keep it steady. Probably the intention was not to restrain her as such, but to keep her still, to enable an image to be taken of her by a camera obscura, a precursor to the photographic camera, and an image that could be later worked up into this portrait. Nevertheless, it is a stark and sobering reminder of her limited agency, which may have even extended to the question of her consent in relation to the making of this portrait. I cannot help but wonder whether the hospital was a good place for her to be. In coming to a judgment about that, however, I'm not entirely left to my own imagination, because here at Bethlem Museum of the Mind, we care for the historic medical records of the hospital as well as for many artworks. And by comparing this portrait with those records and with what Alexander Morrison says in the Physiognomy of Insanity, we're able to recover details of how this patient got on in the hospital. There we find that her name was Elizabeth Jeffries, and that she was discharged after 9 months in the hospital, having made, it would seem, a complete recovery. In describing her case in his book, Morrison highlighted the contributions that gentle laxatives, a nourishing diet, fresh air and exercise made to her recovery. And he presented his readers with this second portrait of her convalescence, just here. In her case, Morrison noted that premature communication with her friends was prejudicial to her recovery at first and prompted greater violence on her part. Elsewhere he wrote that the sight of the child is occasionally of service in puerperal cases, but also that no general rules of treatment can be laid down that are applicable in every case, and that each patient must be studied individually and treatment adjusted accordingly. So perhaps it's not too much to hope that Elizabeth Jeffries' doctors treated her with a modicum of compassion, individual attention, and therapeutic optimism. Hers, after all, was a 19th century success story. She recovered and left the hospital. It would be wonderful to know whether the same could be said of any of Géricault's portraits, and this is the part of the inquiry that Fiona Tan pursues through the next section of 10 Madnesses. We'll return to discuss this in the next video in the series a week from today. So in the meantime, if you can, please read up to the bottom of page 78 of the book. Goodbye for now.